Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Welcome to the programme. Ewan, it's not every day that I get to say that I sort of understand how Rachel Reeves feels. She's due to present the results of her review of the Treasury's review of public finances today. I'm just back from my holiday, so I'm doing quite a similar exercise, actually, where I'm reviewing my own finances and discovering where there are large fiscal holes.
I was going to say, is there isn't a £20 billion black hole in your finances?
I hope not. But that is where we are expecting the Chancellor to discuss the £20 billion shortfall in the government coffers, pointing the finger of blame at the Tories.
Yeah, it also sets the stage for her to pin any future spending squeezes or tax rises or both on the fiscal situation that they inherited. Bloomberg Economics, for their part, think there's a risk that number is even bigger, around £30 billion.
Of course, the challenge is that ahead of the election, Labour promised they wouldn't be raising income tax, national insurance or VAT, so it leaves more limited options for finding the money that's needed. Ahead of today's speech, we spoke to Jonathan Ashworth, who is the former Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary and now CEO of the Labour Together think tank, about this dilemma.
If there are going to be tax changes, I think you'll get a few hints of that today. However, I also know that this government would be so reluctant to increase tax, given what was said in the general election campaign. And I do not expect in a million years that the big promises they made on income tax, VAT and national insurance to be broken. I think they will stick to those promises all the way through because they know that their credibility depends on it.
Well, the challenges are well flagged by our economists here at Bloomberg and organisations like the Institute for Fiscal Studies. If the government does follow the spending plans as it's promised to, the Institute for Government says it will be the tightest budget for day-to-day spending since 2015 and also be tighter than any of the spending reviews under Blair or Brown, including, if you remember, back in 1998 when they stuck to the very tight Conservative plans they inherited from the previous administration.
Let's discuss this further then with Stuart Hoddinott, who's Senior Researcher at the Institute for Government's Public Services team. Stuart, great to have you with us today. Talk us through just the scale of what we're talking about here. How big are the spending commitments that Labour has signed up to before the election?
They are pretty big. They've made commitments on the NHS in terms of funding the long-term workforce plan, which will require quite big spending increases every year, about 3.5% in real terms. They've also committed to increasing defence spending, to increasing the amount of foreign aid spending, to holding per pupil spending flat in real terms, and to childcare spending. So when you take all of that out, it implies there's about a 2.4% cut per year in real terms for other unprotected departments. So this is really quite a significant difficulty and challenge that the Labour Party faces, trying to deal with that. And obviously those departments include things like the Home Office, the Ministry of Justice, the local government department, which all will face quite considerable cuts.
Because, as you say, certain parts of the public sector are protected, aren't they? So the bits that aren't protected are going to be cut heavily. They've already been cut a lot over the last few years, haven't they?
Yes, well, since 2010, some of those are still beneath spending levels when the coalition government took power. So, for example, local governments still have about 10% lower spending power in real terms than they did at the start of last decade. Other services have seen increases, but those increases have not kept pace with demand and have only happened sort of in the last half of last decade. And there are some real problems across public services. I mean, obviously, you've got prisons where the government is close to running out of prison spaces within the next few weeks or days even. So they're scrambling to try and find a solution to that. The courts had their highest backlog on record, and there's just almost a very slow flow of cases through courts. And then obviously local government has some really severe difficulties as well. It has demand for adult social care, children's social care that is really, really straining its finances. You've had a range of local authorities issuing Section 114 or bankruptcy notices in the last few years. And the government is taking sort of extreme measures to try and prop up the local government sector, but in a way that's arguably unsustainable. So yes, it would be really, really difficult to apply those cuts without some very substantial declines in performance across those services.
Because, of course, fixing public services was also a key pledge of Labour during the election campaign as well. So to sort of solve the problems in the protected departments and the unprotected departments, I mean, do we have any idea of how much money would actually be needed to sort of start to address these problems?
It's difficult to say because it depends a little bit on what the government wants to achieve. It's dependent on whether they want to just maintain service performance at the level it's currently at. in which case you're looking at, somewhere in the order of the what Rachel Reeves will lay out. But if you want to significantly increase performance before the next election, we argue in our report that likely will require quite a lot more investment in the short term, although it's not all about money, but it is largely about money often. So it's a little bit dependent on what the government wants to achieve, what their arc of performance is over the course of this parliament. I think there is an element of message management that will come out of this as well. There will be an element of things are really bad, the challenges are really severe, and therefore maybe please bear with us a little bit as we try and address them.
I'm interested to get your thoughts on capital spending. Over the last couple of days, the government's been saying it's going to cut some projects, including the hospital building programme and the £1.7 billion Stonehenge road tunnel, which seems to have been cut repeatedly over many years. Lots of eye rolling in the southwest of England. Just put the cuts to investment spending in a bit of context for us. I was interested in the chart in your research that shows investment spending has been rising, hasn't it, in recent years? But just put it in context over the last few years.
Sure. So we show that the government has consistently underinvested in capital in public services, talking about decades here, not just very recently. But even by that sort of very low standard, the 2010s were particularly bad, with the government cutting capital budgets quite substantially, shifting capital from the capital budgets to, or money from the capital budgets to day-to-day spending to try and plug some of those pressures. And we think that's built up a lot of really severe productivity issues, in particular in hospitals, in courts, and in prisons and schools, which make it very hard for staff to work effectively. Arguably, it's one of the reasons why there's such a long backlog and long waiting times in hospitals at the minute. And in that context, we think it's not particularly helpful to approach capital spending in the same way for this government as the last government has, which is as a sort of a nice to have, but we can cut it at short notice to prop up day-to-day spending. We think that that might be easy to do in the short term, but would arguably lead to longer term worse performance and worse value for money, and would probably require more day-to-day spending to try and make up for it in the future.
What I'm hearing from you and reading your research, Stuart, is that the problems are massive and they're everywhere. What are the key priorities? What needs to be addressed first? If you had your giant money bazooka, where would you be firing it at?
There's it's really quite a range of problems as we lay out in our report. There's problems in the criminal justice system, local government, schools. I think one of the most pressing things has to be prisons. My colleague has written a report about how to address the issues in prisons, but I mean that's a very acute, not to diminish it, not to say unimportant, but very, very short-term thing. I think there are then longer-term issues that we can see across almost all public services. So we, as we've already talked about, we say that the government has long underinvested in capital spending, and that means that there's just reduced productivity across a range of services. We think they've cut spending on more preventative services. So the idea of, investing in public health, for example, or in crime reduction or youth services to try and reduce the demand on the criminal justice system, on hospitals in the future. So we think there needs to be a change in approach there, shifting more spending back towards prevention to try and reduce the pressure on those acute, very expensive services. More specifically, we think that in the NHS hospitals productivity is a real issue. You're not getting very good bang for your buck when you put money into a system that is not turning that money into effective outputs. General practice is in real difficulties with fast declining numbers of GP partners who basically keep the service running. They're the almost individual or sort of independent business owners who deliver GP services. Local government finances are a real issue. They're incredibly fragile, with more local authorities likely to face bankruptcy very, very soon unless the government steps in to do something. And they deliver some really vital services like children's social care, adult social care, homelessness services, that if you don't fund them properly will just continue to deteriorate and will likely push more demand elsewhere in the system. In schools, attainment has dropped off since the pandemic and is improving somewhat, but it's still really, really, really slow to improve. And there's real difficulties recruiting enough teachers. So those are some of the issues in particular areas we think the government should focus on when they start to work out how best to prioritise spending. But obviously then there's a range more outside that, including welfare spending and defence spending, which they also want to address.
That is quite a list. You mentioned productivity in the NHS. Labour's committed to meeting targets on A&E wait times, on cancer treatment, and on ambulance waiting times. How realistic are those pledges, given the levels of funding and the productivity problem?
We think it'd be very difficult to meet all of those within one parliament. The elective waiting list is the longest on record, and waiting times are incredibly long. The last time that the service hit targets for A&E, cancer, and elective wait times was in sort of the middle of last decade, 2015-16, so almost 10 years ago at this point. That's not to say it's impossible. It's just that it will be very hard to fix some of those with the productivity issues in the service. We also say that there's a danger that if you're trying to do everything, you will not be able to focus the service's attention enough to really drive performance across the board. So in the past, when Labour made massive improvements to the elective waiting list in the late 90s and early 2000s, that came from very, very tight focus, lots of funding, and a real sort of brick from the centre on hospital performance. Not to say it's impossible, but it will be very difficult to achieve all of their objectives within this parliament without probably substantial amounts more funding, and also funding going to the right places.
Stuart, this is all very gloomy. I wonder, are there any easy wins here when it comes to fixing public services? Are there things that can be addressed quickly?
I think that you could probably try and reset your relationship with public sector staff. I think that's probably the one area where you could see potentially quite quick wins, just from taking a new approach to how you manage relationships, pay awards compared to the previous government. They were very confrontational. They refused to increase pay following the pandemic and during the period of inflation by as much as the pay review bodies recommended, and that led to the whole bout of industrial action. I think arguably also has led to some of the productivity issues in public services.
Okay.
I mean, it's expensive. It's a very expensive thing to do, but I think you probably can quite quickly reset those relations by accepting the pay awards that are going to be recommended in the next few days, and making clear that you hope to work more constructively with unions going forward.
Okay, Stuart, great to have you with us. Thanks for giving us your expertise. Stuart Hoddinott there, Senior Researcher at the Institute for Government's Public Services team. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe, give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Mia Dawkins and our audio engineer was Sean Gostamakia. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.